Some of you are not sitting where you normally do. It's totally throwing me off, by the way. The unmentioned text for the service so far this week is a TED Talk that we got together on Wednesday and viewed in the fellowship hall from a British ecologist named George Monbiot. And he wanted to talk to the gathered community about something he calls rewilding. He says that as a young man, he had all these periods of adventure in his life. He traveled the world, he was engaged in what at the time didn't feel like risky behavior, but looking back in his age was very risky behavior. And he talks about how he got to a place in his life in which he began to recognize that he felt ecologically bored. His environment was not making use of the evolutionary traits and skills that we are so wired to have. All of that anxiety, fear, predisposition to violence and conflict, all of that stuff. He said he got to a point in which deciding which setting on the dishwasher to press was an exciting moment in the day, and he realized something was wrong. Now, in his talk, he says there's no reason to romanticize what human life 40, 50,000 years ago would have looked like. I don't know exactly how old he was when he gave this talk, but he said, I'm now many years older than the average lifespan of human being in this era that I'm romanticizing. But he said he fell in love with this ecological theory he found out about called rewilding. And he wanted to find out ways to rewild the earth and human life. Rewilding is about taking spaces that humans have basically, not necessarily only through climate, but through either climate change and or human presence, knocked out large species that used to be there. He notes the fact that it wasn't that long ago, actually, that there were elephants and lions in Britain. Yeah, I was surprised at that too. His theory is that we should reintroduce megafauna to environments where we're not used to having them. Bringing back rhinoceros and hippos, lions, tigers, and bears. Oh my, yeah, you got it. To places like outside of London. Now, he said his proposals aren't going so well yet, but he points to experiments in which reintroducing big animals to places where they used to be, but we've kicked them out of, changes everything. He talks about an experiment in which 60-ish wolves were reintroduced back to Yellowstone Park in the 90s. Some of you are nodding your heads, you know about this. So, about 60 wolves were reintroduced to Yellowstone Park, and all the areas where they inhabited began to change dramatically in only a number of years. So wolves had either been killed or had moved away due to human intervention. What had happened was the deer population had grown so much that the deer were eating all of the trees and shrubs and areas down to almost nothing. These valleys and banks that used to be forests were just nothing. They reintroduced wolves, and in only a matter of years, what happened was, A, they ate a lot of deer, but the deer started hanging out in different parts of the park. They didn't want to be in vulnerable places like these valleys, and so they weren't there. And in only a matter of 5 or 10 years, some of the trees quintupled in their size. Places that you would look at that looked like barren landscapes were forests again in a short period of time. And what that did was brought in birds and other mammals. Beavers started to come in and build dams in the river, which brought back different fish species. Coyotes moved out of some of the area. Bears came back and reinforced what the wolves had done. All of a sudden, there were bald eagles where bald eagles had not been. Trees growing where trees had not been. Fish species populating the water and the rivers, new dams, and the rivers literally changed direction. The rivers responded to the wolves. So what happened is because the wolves had changed the ecology of the landscape, the deer weren't eating all the trees around the riverbeds, and the land wasn't running off. All of a sudden, this earth was strong with roots in it, and the rivers began to take straight course. The water literally moved in a different direction because the wolves were present. I thought that was awe-inspiring to me. One lesson is it matters if you show up. Church is certainly different if you show up. Your presence makes a difference you might not ever know about. But at the end of his talk, he points out this profound hope to me. He says, all of our lives we've been telling ourselves the story that ecological change is one direction, decay. And we have seen through direct evidence that ecological change doesn't only have to happen in one direction. That it's possible through tangible acts to take barren landscapes and turn them into wilderness, to rewild our lives. I needed that kind of hope because I care about issues of the earth and climate change and the environment that my son and his children will grow up in. I needed that because the evidence that we're hearing is not one of both directions in ecological change. It's doom and gloom and apocalypse. NASA released a study only a couple of months ago that said we've done irreversible damage that we will see in my lifetime. The world will have less water, will be hotter, and less food. That's not good news. But to hear him talk about the fact that it's possible to reshift the creation that we take part in. See, I'm used to telling the story that almost every culture tells. Whether it's the Hindu version of the Kali Yuga, which is the age of destruction and decay, or the narrative of the Garden of Eden from the Hebrew Scriptures and the Christian tradition, which says the world was pure and now is in a state of decay, or the story I tell myself that our political landscape is only going to get worse and worse, and that economics here in our country are only getting worse and worse. Suddenly he injected this evidence in that said, no, hope is possible. And I needed that. My sabbatical project is about ecology, or at least a big chunk of it is. And it revolves around, or at least is inspired by the work of Henry David Thoreau, whose Walden we read this morning. That's not the first time you've heard Walden, most of you at least. Now, it's hard to talk about ecology in a Unitarian Universalist context without mentioning our good friend Henry David. He was one of the first people to actually mark climate change. We're using his journals of when flowers were blooming and temperatures and water levels to mark climate change in some ways. He was one of the first people in the States to do this. But his work stands out as so profoundly impactful on me because he talks like he's writing in 2014. He's made a big impact on me and my family. Our son's name is Henry. That was no mistake. And the project that my wife and I are designing, we're calling Walden at White Rock. We live near the lake. I want to tell you a little bit about Henry David Thoreau and who he was today, because I think it's easy for us to treat these transformative figures in our faith as these abstract people. And he was not abstract at all. So our good friend Henry David looked like this. He had a neck beard that his friends made fun of him ruthlessly about. This is Henry David. He was born in the early 1800s. He grows up in a Unitarian family. His dad has a pencil factory. He goes to Harvard at a young age, but he can't afford tuition, so his brother John gives him the money to fund his tuition. And Henry David Thoreau was frugal before it was hip. When he graduated from Harvard, they did this thing, which they still do, which is a scam, and they say, if you want, your diploma, we can frame it for you, and it's going to cost you an incredible amount of money. Back then it was $5, and he said, let the sheep keep its skin, was his response. They used to make them out of sheepskin. He said, I'm not giving you $5 for that diploma. He went off and he taught school for a couple of years with his brother John. He was at a school that had corporal punishment. And when he and his brother refused To engage in corporal punishment of the students, they were forced to resign, which they did so very publicly. He was big about making a big public display of his opinions. They left, and he moved out to Concord, Massachusetts. Concord, the site of those famous battles of the Revolutionary War, the shot heard around the world. Actually, the first battle of the Revolutionary War was on Emerson's granddad's backyard. Yeah, he called it the War of My Backyard. And he's working for a few years, as Emerson's hand for a few years. His brother John cut himself shaving and died of lockjaw when Henry David was 25. Different era, huh? Cut himself shaving and died when Henry was 25 years old, and his brother John died in his arms. He goes into this period of kind of distress and grief. And he's already kind of an eccentric guy who tells you what his opinions are already. But one of his good friends named Ellery Channing, who, if you're keeping the family tree here, is the nephew of William Ellery Channing, the famous Unitarian minister. His buddy Ellery Channing tells him, "You are terrible to live with. Why don't you go out to the woods and devour yourself alive?" This is his quote. "Or get over it." Henry David says, "Fine, I will go to the woods and devour myself alive." So he gets his friend Emerson to let him squat on his land at Walden Pond. Emerson owned the land around Walden. Henry David borrows an axe, cuts down 12 trees to make the beams and joints of his cabin, and lives for 2 years and 2 months on that land, living out a experiment in simple living. Now, he's an odd guy, and the city of Concord thinks, what's that odd guy doing out there in the woods by himself? And in fact, in the beginning of Walden, he says, "I know a lot of you have been asking, what have I been doing out there? So here's my account." But he's a real human being. He's not some abstract guy. I mean, Louisa May Alcott, one of his friends, says to him, "If you don't shave that ugly neck beard, no woman is ever going to want to be with you." And she writes Emerson a letter that says, "We can be assured of Henry David's chastity all his life." Referencing the neckbeard again. In fact, his, I guess you'd call him friend, Nathaniel Hawthorne, wrote, "Thoreau is ugly as sin," said that he was friendly, and that was a good thing because of his appearance, that he needed this. These are his friends. And so he goes out for 2 years and 2 months. He moves there on July 4th, 1845. And he moves to Walden Pond. This is Walden Pond, for those of you who haven't been there. It's gorgeous. We take the coming of age class every year, and I get all evangelical about Walden with them, and we put our feet in the water, and we read Walden, and they make fun of me for reading Walden from a Kindle, and we go and we sit by the banks of this pond. So this is where he lived for 2 years and 2 months. Every day in a cabin he built with his own hands. He had a bean field in the backyard. He built the cabin from those trees in an old shed he had bought from an Irish immigrant who was moving on to have a new job. And this is the replica of his little cabin. It was small. And every year we take the coming of age class to the site where his cabin actually was. You can see this is the view he would have had looking at the water from his cabin. He bathed in the water just at that spot right where you can see. He said that was the most religious experience of his day. He would get up in the mornings and read the Bhagavad Gita and bathe in Walden Pond. He said, "This is what you've got to do." And these rocks here, it's a tradition if you go visit to bring a stone with you and to lay it on the spot where Henry David's cabin was and to take a stone back with you. He died at age 44 of tuberculosis. Emerson gave the eulogy at his funeral. And he's buried in Sleepy Hollow Cemetery in Concord on Author's Ridge, which is right next to the Alcotts and the Hawthorns and the Emersons. And this is his little grave. Now this is in contrast to Emerson's grave. If you go, and you should, this is a pilgrimage site for us. Emerson's grave is like this, a huge, heavy stone, and his family plot is giant, and then Henry David's just says Henry. People leave pencils for him. He said that when he was in his cabin, sometimes he'd go off walking, and he would realize he'd had a visitor because someone would have left him a little leaf or a walnut on the door, and so people leave little leaves. And like I said, his dad ran a pencil factory he worked in for a little bit, and Henry David Thoreau actually invented this graphite process that changed the way pencils were made at this one point. So people leave little pencils to honor him and his writing career there at his grave. So while he's out at Walden Pond, he discovers some things that make him, to me, seem like a contemporary. He writes and he says, the fashion industry is designed entirely to fool you into believing that you need something this year that you didn't need last year. He says, in fact, the factories where these clothes are made have unsafe working conditions where poor people are giving poor wages so that rich people can become richer. He says, the people are going into crazy amounts of debt to buy bigger houses than they can afford. He says, we take a nap for 30 minutes and we wake up going, what's the news? I've got to know what happened. And this is before Facebook. He sounds like he's writing in 2014 to me. And he says that the answer for him was to drive life into a corner. Simplify, 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 he wrote. I saw someone the other day write, why did he have to write simplify 3 times? He talks about being out in the woods and the visitors he has, and he says he actually did have a lot of visitors. People would come by, land surveyors, or people who were riding on the trains, which he could hear coming in and out of Concord. He said for him, hope for a new kind of life came from knowing from personal experience what you needed and what you didn't. That being in the presence of wild nature was good for your soul. He said, I was alone no more than the birds were alone or the lake was alone. In fact, he has this long paragraph where he says, in fact, I met the person who dug the pond. And he talks in this long span until you realize he's talking about God. And he says, I had often conversations with the individual who dug the pond. He says we lead lives of quiet desperation at a pace of life which is beyond anything it was intended to be, going into debt to buy clothes and homes we cannot afford, running ourselves ragged in work that when we get to the end of our lives we will say, why did we do this? And the answer was to pare down and find only the essentials of life. But I think one aspect that people forget is that he ends that reading we heard today by saying, and then publish what I found to the world. If it was sublime, I wanted to let people know it's sublime. If it was mean, I would let them know it was mean. And people forget he left Walden. He left. Then he lived in Emerson's house for a little bit and was kind of the surrogate for Emerson in his home while he was traveling. He went to jail for not paying his taxes because he didn't want to support slaveholding states. He wrote a passionate defense for John Brown, the man who blew up Harper's Ferry. He left Walden, this idyllic retreat, and then was involved in the important affairs of the day. So you can tell I care about him and this. I've restrained myself in telling you about Thoreau and Walden. But this has had a tremendous impact on what I want to do with my time away. And I recognize the unique preciousness of this gift, this necessary rest in an odd job, and I want you to know I intend on making the most of it. But in a kind of pre-Thoreau-esque experiment, people are already going, what do you intend to do out there, Aaron? So I thought I'd tell you. The practical aspect of my sabbatical project, on the one hand, is to increase my Spanish skills so that I can be in better conversation with the fastest growing demographic in our city. That one people get. They don't ask me too many questions to clarify that one. The second is that my wife and I are engaging in an experiment in sustainable living right here in the city of Dallas. We don't intend to go in a cabin in the woods. We're going to stay in our home to live deliberately. And this is where the questions come. Practically, we're going to try and reduce our consumption by 25%. Fuel, water, electricity, and waste. By 25%. We thought that was a big enough number to actually make us work toward it, but maybe we could achieve it as a first step. Our intention is to grow, build, borrow, fix, and share more than we are currently doing, and to consume far less than we're currently consuming. This is probably going to look like collecting rainwater and messing with solar panels in our home and building solar generators, and I've got an idea for one on a bicycle. We'll see how that goes. I'll be riding my bike around town when I don't need to use the car or taking public transit. We'll grow more food than we grow, continue to make things like soap and detergent and all of that at our house, mend our clothes when they break, and learn how to fix things instead of immediately throwing them away. What we want to do is see what's possible when you don't move into the woods. What's possible living in what we think is kind of an average-sized middle-class home in kind of an average middle-class neighborhood in the city of Dallas. We'll see. We'll see how it goes. We're prepared for a little failure. That's going to be okay. But the practical aspect of it is not really what's most important to us. The theological foundation for this project is based in deepening relationships. So we intend to deepen relationships with self, family, our city, the earth, and the divine. Now, the first question people ask me when they know I'm going on sabbatical is, where are you going? Always. Where are you going? And my response is always, nowhere. I'm staying right here. But the second question, once they hear about this plan, is your wife on board with that? Almost invariably, and thankfully she is. This would be a hard thing to do if she wasn't. But our intention is to be in better relationship with literally the soil on which we live. That we will learn how to speak with the people in Dallas better. This is not a self-sufficiency experiment, actually, at all. I intend to depend on others more than I've ever depended on others. I want to learn from my neighbors who know how to pickle and can and fix and build things. I want to find out who in my neighborhood and city is already engaged in these alternative economies. I'm already finding out that this is going to require me being in relationship with people beyond the boundaries that we normally find ourselves in around race and religion and politics and class. I'm in communication with Mormon homeschooling moms in Richardson about techniques that they use. I'm talking with folks at Paul Quinn College here in town, a historically black college that decided that instead of a football field, they wanted an urban farm, that it was better for their demographic to have a farm than to have football. I'm going to an Anabaptist community in Waco where they have these 500 acres where they live together and teach you how to make furniture by hand and make soap in a big cast iron kind of skillet. And to find that all those different groups are finding hope in the same place makes me feel alive and hopeful for this kind of project. To know that Mormon homeschooling moms and the Haitian peasants that we visited months ago who told me, you know what would improve our lives? Rainwater collection and solar panels and growing more of our own food. That Paul Quinn College and Haitian peasants and Mormon homeschooling moms and Anabaptists in Waco and me, this yupster in East Dallas, that we're all finding a source of shared hope for what is possible on planet Earth in some of the same activities. I love it. It makes me feel at home in my own state and city and planet. But the point for us as a church is not about this project, right? Our religion rests on an assumption that there is a deep and profound hope built into the foundation of reality itself. In fact, we've made a metaphysical claim about that. Going back in our history, we've articulated that possibility is built into the fabric of reality itself. One of our greatest theologians, a man named James Luther Adams, wrote what he called the 5 smooth stones of liberal religion. These are the 5 foundational truths of what it means to be in a liberal faith. And the last one, he said, is that we have an attitude of ultimate optimism. Not immediate optimism. Ultimate optimism. Because what he said is that as religious liberals, we believe that the resources available for meaningful change are so present in any moment that it justifies us being ultimately optimistic about what's possible on earth. He said, even when the ship's going down, even in the prison camp, even in the midst of violence or genocide and war, even in the midst of environmental catastrophe, even then, human care and creativity is possible. Something is always possible. Now, science affirms this, right? That image you came in to see this morning in the sanctuary is the Eagle Nebula. That's where baby stars are born. Those are elements that will be forming into stars and planets, or maybe already have, and we haven't seen them yet. What we know from physics and cosmology is that the matter of the universe is literally pregnant with all the future. And I like a hopeful story. I heard that hope in George Monbiot's work, where I've been wringing my hands about the future of our planet, believing that at best I can provide hospice care. And he says no. It doesn't only work in one direction. And Thoreau in 1845, not 2014, said, "Do you know you don't have to live this way? You don't have to be tired and poor, going into debt to buy things you don't need to impress people you don't know or maybe even like." He said, "Here's a center, a kernel of hope, and I found it and I want to share it with the world." Now, what is religion at all if not an organized participation in hope? Whether that hope is the person of Jesus, or that hope is enlightenment that comes through mindfulness, whether that hope is love and justice infused in the world, what is religion if not organized participation in what builds hope on earth? And so I believe that our calling, each and every one of us, is to discern where we believe hope is alive and well on earth, and then get about publishing it to anyone who will listen. Now, I don't doubt that not everyone's answer is going to look like mine. But if it does, and I think it's important or else I wouldn't be doing it, you can be a part of those efforts here in the church. You can go to the social action table after the service and be a part of the climate action team. But I know that not everybody's answer is going to look like mine. I know that for some of you, you look at the intentional raising of a child and see hope for human life on earth. I know that for some of you, getting sober and helping other people become sober has been a kernel of hope that you want to share. I know that for some of you, it looks like medicine or public service or art and beauty. But whatever it is, whether you are George Monbiot or Henry David Thoreau or you, our job and part of a living faith is to discern where we believe hope is alive and well on the planet Earth, to find 2 or 3 people who believe that same thing at least, and to get about publishing that to the world, to any and everyone who will listen. None of us has an infinite time on this planet, and like our good friend Henry David said, there will be a time when the better part of us is made into compost. We will all go back to the earth to give the gift of our bodies back one day. But until that day, we can find where hope dwells and moves in us and get about sharing that good news as much as possible. May it be true for you. Amen.